scientists had a problem. Their climate model predicted dense forests covering Europe 100,000 years ago. But ancient pollen trapped in sediments told another story. Open landscapes, grasslands where trees should have existed. They tried climate. It didn't fit. They tried large herbivores. That didn't work either. They tried natural fires. It still didn't work, until they added a factor no one expected to find so far back in time. And then everything fell into place. Someone had been transforming Europe since long before agriculture, since before even our own species. There is a widely accepted idea about our past, the belief that human beings began to significantly transform the planet with the arrival of agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago. Before that, according to this narrative, our hunter-gatherer ancestors simply adapted to nature, inhabiting ecosystems that remained essentially unmodified. A study recently published by Nicolina and collaborators calls this assumption into question in a remarkable way. The research team carried out something that, according to the authors, constitutes the first attempt to integrate multiple datasets into a model spanning such an extensive period. They compared two different ways of reconstructing European vegetation of the past. On one hand, they used a climate model called CARA-IB that predicts what type of vegetation should exist based on atmospheric conditions. On the other hand, they analyzed reconstructions based on ancient pollen preserved in lakes and bogs, obtained through the REVEALS model. The logic was straightforward. If climate were the only determining factor of vegetation, both methods should produce similar results, but they found consistent discrepancies. The climate model predicted denser forests covering much of Europe during two specific periods. The last interglacial, approximately 130,000 years ago, and the early Holocene, between 11,700 and 8,000 years before present. However, the pollen record showed significantly more open landscapes than climate alone could explain. To investigate what was causing this difference, the researchers used a tool called HUMLAND, an agent-based model that simulates interactions between multiple factors capable of modifying vegetation, climate, large herbivores that consume plants, fires caused by electrical storms, and intentional burns carried out by hunter-gatherers. They combined it with a genetic algorithm, a system that tests thousands of different scenarios until finding those whose results match what the ancient pollen actually indicates. The results were revealing. When they ran simulations, including only climate, megafauna, and natural fires, very few scenarios produced landscapes similar to those recorded by the pollen. But when they added intentional burns carried out by human groups, the majority of generated scenarios matched the pollen evidence. This suggests that European hunter-gatherers, including Neanderthals during the last interglacial and anatomically modern humans during the Mesolithic, were actively modifying their ecosystems through the use of fire. They were not passive observers of nature. According to the model's estimates, Mesolithic humans would have modified approximately 26% of the distribution of plant functional types in Europe, with maximum values of 47%. The impact on the overall openness of vegetation was more modest, around 8% on average, with a maximum of 14%. One of the most interesting findings emerges when comparing Neanderthals with Mesolithic humans. Despite being separated by a complete glacial cycle, both groups showed remarkably similar behavioral patterns according to the model. They influenced areas of comparable size around their camps. they shared similar preferences regarding vegetation openness, and the number of groups necessary to explain the observed changes was comparable in both periods. The researchers also identified another mechanism of landscape transformation: hunting. By reducing populations of large herbivores, hunter-gatherers indirectly altered grazing pressure on vegetation. According to the model, even in scenarios without anthropogenic burns, hunting would have produced landscapes different from those that would exist without human presence. It is important to note, as the authors themselves do, that this study has significant limitations. The coverage of pollen data for the last interglacial is geographically limited, concentrated mainly in Central Europe. The temporal alignment between different data sets for that period is problematic. The model assumes that all fires completely replace the vegetation of a cell, which is a simplification, and the data on electrical storm frequency come from modern observations, not from the studied period. The authors describe their work explicitly as a modeling exercise that challenges previous assumptions, not as a definitive demonstration. Continental scale comparisons for the last interglacial, they warn, should be interpreted with caution. That said, the findings have implications worth considering. For decades, conservation projects have sought to restore ecosystems to natural reference states, assuming that such states existed before significant human intervention. But if human beings have been modifying European landscapes for tens of thousands of years, the question arises naturally: what exactly is that reference state we intend to restore? The authors note that identifying baselines for conservation is a challenge precisely due to the complexities of past environmental processes. This study adds evidence that the distinction between natural and cultural landscapes might be more blurred than we have traditionally assumed, at least in Europe. What this work suggests, with appropriate caution, is that the capacity to modify ecosystems through fire and hunting could be a characteristic deeply rooted in the human lineage. Not something that emerged with agriculture or industry, but a practice that we possibly shared with evolutionary relatives like the Neanderthals. Understanding this history of environmental modification does not necessarily tell us what we should do in the present, but it does offer us perspective on the relationship between human beings and their environments over time, a relationship that, according to this study, could have been more active and transformative than we used to think long before anyone planted the first seed.